Welcome to episode 11 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Last week we started our examination of issues surrounding the void, which is the section of text we're currently reading. Today we'll continue on the same theme as we now join the discussion.
I've been busy keeping up with the medical stuff with the virus, and I have not had a chance to listen to the podcast that you all did last week, and I haven't read this section in advance, but I hope I'll still have anything to say about it, but I'm not as prepared as I have been.
You are not alone. I did start reading the text earlier this morning, but I didn't finish.
You know, I have some thoughts on that, too. I'm still thinking that, I know you guys haven't listened to what I posted with Martin last week. Martin and I spent most of the time talking about some just general background issues in regard to this. This is something that we'll never have the opportunity to do again, is to cold, without a lot of preparation, talk about some background questions that it might be interesting to get initial impressions of without having first boned up on the background. So
I think that's true too, because then I think it's more accessible to people who don't have a background in philosophy. You know, they're not trained philosophers like we're not, and to feel our way through this the way they would might be interesting. Yeah, that's great.
Last week, Martin and I talked about some basic issues surrounding why Epicurus would be concerned about the void. And I think I'd like to stay with that today and get the impressions from Julie and Elaine and Charles that we didn't get last week. But I'd still like to read the text again. And so I don't know whose turn it is.
I think it's Julie's turn.
I think it's Julie's turn too. But I'm thinking that some of the questions that we ought to talk about today, it would be good for us to quote a section that comes after what we're doing today. And I don't want to try to read all the way down to it. But let me point out what is said at around line 420, because I think that this is maybe a summary of what we are really talking about in detail.
Okay.
Because what I see at line 420 in the Daniel Brown edition is sort of the conclusion, I think, of part of this section, which is, quote, all nature, therefore, in itself considered is one of these, is body or is space, in which all things are placed, and from which the various motions of all beings spring. That there is body, common sense will show. This as a fundamental truth must be allowed, or there is nothing we can fix as certain in our pursuit of hidden things by which to find the truth or prove it when 'tis found. Then if there were no place or space, we call it void, bodies would have nowhere to be, nor could they move at all, as we have fully proved to you before. Besides, there is nothing you can strictly say, it is neither body nor void, which you may call a third degree of things distinct from these. For every being must in quantity be more or less, and if it can be touched, though ne'er so small or light, it must be body, and so esteemed. But if it can't be touched, and has not in itself a power to stop the course of other bodies as they pass, this is the void we call empty space. Some background questions that have come to my attention that I think are relevant to why we're even discussing this. And I'd like to think about them after we read the main text. But what does it mean to say that something exists? And what does it mean to say that something does not exist? The answers to that question are not necessarily very obvious. And another question is, if we consider the word universe to mean everything, and when I say everything, I mean not just our star system or our cosmos, but all star systems, everything. If you take universe to mean everything, if you say that something doesn't exist in this universe, Do you think it's possible that it can exist in another universe? And if not, why not? And then there's some related questions that I think I'll postpone talking about right now. But there's some basic questions, I think, about what does it mean to say that something exists or does not exist that are important to probably why this is being even discussed. So with that as background, Julie, will you read the text for us?
And yet all things are not formed of close and solid parts. In things there is a void, which in your searches into nature will be of use to know. This will preserve your wandering mind from doubt, prevent your constant toil by judging right of nature's laws. Wherefore there is a place we call a void, an empty space, intangible, or else no bodies could be moved or stir. The quality all bodies have to stop and to oppose does never fail, so that to move would be in vain to try, no body first by yielding would give way. But now we see before our eyes that things move various ways in seas, in earth, and in the heaven above. But were there no void, they would not be deprived of that activity of motion only, but would not be at all, for matter wedged and crowded close on every side had ever been at rest. Besides, though things appear of solid parts composed, yet you will find them, in some measure, formed of bodies that are rare. The liquid moisture of the water sweats through rocks and stones, and all things weep with drops abundant. The food that every creature eats disperses through the body. The trees increase and grow, and in due season shew their fruit. Because the juices from the low roots spread through the trunk and over all the boughs. Sounds pass through strong partitions and fly quick through walls of houses, and the piercing cold strikes through the very bones. But were no void, no empty space, that bodies ever should pass, you'd find a thing impossible to prove. Again, why do we see some things exceed others in weight, though of equal size? For if as much of body went to form a ball of wool as made a ball of lead, their weight would be the same. For the quality of body is to press downward, but a perfect void by nature has no weight, so that a body of equal size but lighter in its weight proves it has more of empty space. So again, the heavier body has more of solid parts, 'tis plain, and has within it less void. And this is doubtless what with reason's searching eye we look for, mixed with things, we call it space. But I am forced to step before and answer what some pretend, lest you should be seduced from truth. They say the waters yield to fish making their way and open their liquid paths. For when the fish have left a space, that instant thither the yielding waters circling flow. By the same rule, all beings may be moved among themselves and change their former place, though all things should be full. But this, 'tis plain, is false throughout, for how could fish advance at all unless the waters gave them way? And whither should the waves retire if the fish did not move, and leave a space behind, so that all bodies must be deprived of motion, or you must say a void is mixed with everything from whence each being first derives a power to move. Lastly, if two broad bodies meet, and instantly are separated again, the air must needs fill up the void that is between. But this air, though it should hurry with its swiftest powers, it cannot all at once fill up the space these bodies will disclose at parting. First the nearest part will be filled up, and then the more remote, until the whole be full. If one should say when these flat bodies meet the air is condensed, but when they part the air is rarefied, 'tis a mistake, for then here must be void where there was none before, and that void that was before must now be full. In such a case the air can't be condensed, and if it could, it can't without a void contract itself, and so reduce its part into a closer space. Wherefore, perplex the matter as you please, you must confess in things there is a void.
Oh, he's got a lot of physics there that I didn't realize that they were thinking about back then. It's neat.
And it goes much further than this as the chapter goes forward, so we'll have a lot of this to deal with. Last week, Martin and I talked some about the physics of it, and we want to talk about that today too, I think. But even more so than trying to compare this to modern physics, I'm thinking that it is important for us to get a grounding on where Epicurus was at this point and why he considered this to be important. He is obviously arguing that the void exists, but it's not necessarily clear what the word exists means. What do you guys think about that question?
I think that's a trick of language. I think that you have to be careful with things like that because this is where abstraction can really lead you wrong. So just because a word exists does not mean that it represents a thing. So the void is no thing. The void is nothing there. So I think that's entirely a language issue. Don't get mixed up in it.
I think you're completely right about that, but I also think that this is a common problem for people when they get into philosophy. They'll run into questions like this, and they need to understand what the right approach to responding to it is. And I think we're going to see that. I think we see that illustrated in what Epicurus is doing here.
But to me, that's like asking if a person is dead, do they exist? It's
right.
It's a word game. So we all know if you just think about it, not words wise, just represent it with bodies and empty space. It's clear what it means, but then you get language into it, and it could be easy to create paradoxes where there are no paradoxes.
And in fact, last week we talked about some of Zeno's paradoxes,
yes,
about how you can allege that it's impossible to move, that everything really is one, and that motion is an illusion. There's no doubt in my mind that that's a word game and trickery, and it is something to avoid. But how do we give confidence to people in avoiding it? Just to say that it's a game, does that even tell us that it's true or false? We really need a grounding in what we are going to be confident about and what we're not going to be confident about. What does the word possible mean? What does the word probable mean? What does the word certain mean? Where do we even begin to approach questions like that?
So I think that we approach in the way Epicurus did. Everything that we're saying has got to refer to something you could actually observe, and that is what keeps you
Elaine,
out of the weeds.
You have not observed, I think personally, anything outside of our universe. Does that mean that nothing outside of our universe exists?
No. But if we're imagining the possibility of that, we're still referring to observations here that we made. So extrapolating is a different process from letting the words themselves be more what is real than observable reality. It's a totally different thing that would be going on in your mind. It's not abstract. It's just, extrapolating your imagination to, other possibly observable things that we can't see. I don't think that is in any way related process.
Okay, let's talk about one of the classic questions. You've never seen any evidence of God. Does that mean that God does not exist?
Right. So we have no objective evidence of anything like a God. So we're not even extrapolating from known observables. We have no basis for it. So it's pure imagination. There's nothing to it. It's not a useful thing to even talk about.
Okay, you've used the word pure observables and extrapolating from pure observables.
No, I didn't say pure observables. I said pure imagination.
Or pure imagination. And I'm sorry, you did say that. And then you said extrapolating from observables versus pure imagination.
Yes.
What is our confidence? Where's the bright line? Why do we take the position that extrapolating from observables is the prudent way to approach things as opposed to pure imagination?
I would say by experience, because it often results when you're able to investigate further in evidence. But we have to be careful. This is one of the things you've got to hold loosely. You can't say that we know that these things that we're extrapolating from our observations are right. We might have made mistakes in doing that. It's not as reliable, but it has a higher chance just historically. Empirically, it has a higher chance of being accurate than just making stuff up.
I want to add one thing to that, though, because if you start to, make things up in your mind, right, that don't have any basis in observation, you can make up 100 different things. And then how do you know which one is right? And all of that is going to lead to the doubt and confusion that Epicurus is trying to prevent.
Right. That's excellent. That's perfect. That needs to be said. I think about, I've known people who were in 12-step groups, trying to listen, or any kind of religious group trying to listen to what God, they were giving everything over to their God, and so they were trying to figure out what God was telling them versus what their mind was telling them. And it was like torture for them, because like, well, how do I know what's my voice and what's God's voice? So yeah, if you don't have an anchor in observable reality, you're lost and you're going to be anxious.
Epicurus did talk quite a bit about worlds and heavenly bodies in his letter to Pythocles, and his basis for all of this was by laying down a definition, something that is observable, something that is based completely in reality.
Yeah.
Or his definitions, Charles, were explained by pointing to things that are observable to us through our senses in our reality. That is how he defines something. And so that is a perfect segue for me to ask this question. Let's take the example of a square circle. Can a square circle exist?
Well, that's another word game, because you've defined, we have definitions of what is a square and definitions of a circle.
Mm-hmm. It's taking two confined definitions of shapes that everyone agrees on and clashing them together.
Right.
We don't have a conception of a square circle.
Well, it's outside of our definitions. Our concepts don't overlap.
Mm-hmm.
So it's clear we can show it leads to contradictions. That means that doesn't exist.
Right.
Why, Martin? Why do we take the position that a contradiction cannot exist?
This is what we observe in our world, that our world actually is logic.
Anybody else?
I still think you're mixing up words and observations. Although we're applying the word circle to describe shapes that we see, and that's a word we've agreed on, we've also defined it mathematically, and the mathematical definitions of square and circle don't overlap. But it's not because that's some kind of weirdness in reality. It's because we picked those definitions. There's nothing weird or funny or magical about that. It should just be like, well, duh. Of course it can't, because we defined it so that it couldn't.
And does that mean, Elaine, then, that you are certain in taking the position that a square circle cannot exist in this or any other universe?
Not if the definition is the same, because the way we've defined it guarantees that it can't. So the question itself is a sort of a nonsense question.
It's not really a nonsense question. It is a question which we then can plainly answer, no, it does not exist.
Yeah, but to even think that there's a possible answer other than of course not, it just feels silly to me to ask that, because when people will ask that question, sometimes they'll get a feeling of, oh, wow, isn't that weird? Or like there's something profound about it, but there's nothing profound about that. It's not, I don't know.
In this case, it's obvious. In other cases, where a question like that shows up, it may not be that obvious. So we need to work out more to come to the answer no, or maybe yes.
Yeah, I can agree with that. But this particular question is not. It's not even. I don't know. I don't understand why anybody would ask it.
Later in this book one, Lucretius will talk about how Heraclitus does exactly what Elaine just referred to in causing people to say, wow, that's a very profound question.
Yes.
And that there are people who really enjoy just getting into that profundity and then just get themselves totally confused about things. But as we're saying, people do ask questions like this. I've got a specific example. I'll cite to it another time. But
okay.
The square circle question is something that probably does help us grapple with the contradiction, or as Elaine is saying, whether it's even legitimate to ask the question. Because what is a square and what is a circle? Do squares and circles exist in nature?
Well, it depends on how you're defining those. So, you have your mathematical definition of square and circle, and then you have like the general consensus, like my TV is square. And everybody knows what you mean, that the sides of the shape are equal and that the angles are at right angles. It's not a confusing thing. But are you getting at, is there an abstract realm of square and circle?
I'm definitely trying to unpack.
Math is abstractly in reality? No.
I'm definitely getting at unpacking the question. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, and so how we can link this mathematical definition, which may some people interpret as referring to an idealistic realm, and our actual observation is we attach an error bar to the mathematical definition, and then everything what is false within that error description would then be in practice considered to be a circle.
Yeah, right.
You used the word arrow, and then the last word you said error, an error bar.
E-double-R, yes.
Okay.
E-double-R-O-R.
And then the very last word you said, then everything within that would be a what?
Would be a circle. No? So if we start off from the mathematical definition and then allow for some tolerance around it, then anything what fits into that tolerance would be a circle.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And we do that sort of roughly just with our vision all the time.
So basically, there are circular objects. There are, I guess you would say rectangular, not squarish objects in nature.
Yeah, and close enough to a square that we would say that's square.
Sure.
Yeah, like with Martin said, within error. So we don't think that there's some realm out there with perfect circles and perfect squares like Plato would have.
I was just going to bring that up. There's no abstraction or reasoning that tells us that this is a perfect square in this every single capacity. It's usually found through consensus.
Yeah.
Like Martin said about the errors and the tolerance of it.
Right.
And not having perfect squares found throughout nature. Which does remind me, in the letter to Epicurus, Epicurus talks about how an outline of a world could be spherical or three-cornered, or any kind of shape at all. I don't know if he's talking about a triangle or he's extrapolating this three-cornered shape that we can't really comprehend. Because it wouldn't be a pyramid if it only had three corners. But he compared it right next to a sphere, not a circle. And then goes on to say it could be any kind of shape.
I tend to think that Epicurus is probably emphasizing in his own mind the any kind of shape, because I don't think he would put any kind of mystical or abstract value on a shape, which of course the Pythagoreans were doing, as I understand it.
Oh yeah. So are we going to look? I'm kind of interested in looking at this section of the poem as we did with the matter, like the different arguments that he uses in each section here, how they come together and how convincing they would be to somebody who hadn't thought about the idea of void.
Where would you like to dig into it, Elaine?
Well, so the first section where he just talks about how you couldn't move, I think is fairly convincing. The first thing that I thought about then was one time I went to a New Year's in New Orleans. I don't recommend it, but my ex was in law school there at the time at Tulane. And so we didn't go to Mardi Gras there. That was just too much. But we went to New Year's and we were in this crowd and I realized that I couldn't fall down. That if I were to trip, the crowd was moving, but because there was moving into a void where there was no crowd, but within the crowd, there was no room for me to fall over. That if I fell, I would not fall. I would just be carried along. It was a really, really weird feeling to be packed that tight, to strangers. It's by making this argument, any layperson could say, oh yeah, that's right. Something else has got to move for this object to move. If they're close together, you wouldn't be able to move if there were no space for something else to move into. So I think that's a good argument. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
Maybe we should remind ourselves as well of the context of the pre-existing Zeno's paradox, which said that things do not move. It's all an illusion.
Right.
And so Epicurus would have known that people argued that kind of thing.
Yes,
that
right.
All is one. Everything is a
yes.
Whether it's divine fire or some other element, everything is one. But in this paragraph that Elaine has just read, it says, quote, but now we see before our eyes that things move, unquote. So he is trusting in what his eyes tell him to establish that things do move, regardless of any logical proof from Zeno or anyone else that things do not move.
Yeah, great. I knew a dentist who was like kind of doing some amateur physics, and he had convinced himself using Zeno's paradox and some Russian physicist who believes in the black universe that the only possible answer was the black universe, and that this meant that we were all one being.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of it was elaborate but full of holes. His whole plan, how he got to this from various things in physics. But he spent a lot of time on it. And I'm not a physicist, but I read it and I said, hey, dude, this and this here, you've made these leaps that you don't have any. He didn't realize where he'd made the leaps because he got so excited about his words. And then he realized it wasn't true. But that is what happens if you stop making observations. You can talk yourself in all sort of crazy mess.
And any philosophy student in any college is going to run into exactly that argument.
Yeah.
It's also partially just the idea of abstraction versus something that is concrete. Because when you start talking about Zeno's paradox, really what you're talking about is like a number line, right?
Yeah.
And a number line is very abstract. But technically, the idea of a circle is an abstraction. The idea of a square is an abstraction.
Sure.
It's something that we have just made up to describe the things that we are seeing. But when you get into an abstraction like that, that's when you start to get into all of these things that don't necessarily apply to reality.
Yeah.
So division being the important one with Zeno's paradox, right?
Yeah.
Infinite division, is that what you've said?
Yeah, so I guess it would have to be infinite division. But I mean, with a number line, there's an infinite number of real numbers in between 2 points, any 2 points, right?
Yes.
So yeah.
And I'm having a conversation. There's a person that I know in reality that I'm conversing with on a website, on an agnostic website, about how people can communicate who are abstractionists. Is there a way for abstractionists and materialists to communicate? And his thought was that I lacked abstract thought.
Oh my God.
Which I thought was, I'm like, whoa, I'm, actually sure that I know how to think abstractly. I've done advanced calculus. I don't have any trouble manipulating concepts with my mind. I just know that they're tricky. They can backfire, they can get you into the weeds, and that you're more likely to find things that you can actually use in life by always keeping stuff connected to reality, which is what Epicurus said. Keep the stuff grounded in reality and don't, just go flipping off into the abstract realm, which is a decision which is totally different from an inability. This sort of fascinated me that would be his thought.
I've met hundreds of people who think that abstraction, or even just like trying to find like a Kantian notion of pure logic, is superior to materialism.
Yes.
They've convinced themselves that just because you have to think about it, it's superior or better, or more true,
more sophisticated, more evolved.
I think it would be safe to say that we don't deny that abstractions are useful, that abstractions in a sense exist.
Yeah.
But we also say that abstractions have, and this is a word that Epicurus uses a lot, a limit. There's a limit to what abstractions can do. There's a limit to what they are. They are not reality themselves. Within their realm of limited sphere of action or sphere of existence, they're very useful and very helpful and valid within their sphere. But they are not reality itself. There's a limit to which they describe reality. They can describe reality extremely well in certain respects. You can use calculus or algebra or geometry to perform all sorts of things in the real world, to fly to the moon and predict exactly where you want to be and how much thrust and so forth. But those calculations are not themselves reality.
Yeah. So in the next section, so he's talked about, bodies moving, and then he talks about, liquids seeping through things to show space in a stationary body, which is another way of observing, well, there's got to be some space for that to go into. So not just solid bodies, but a liquid body, a liquid spreading through a solid body. And even sound, that's really cool that he was of course, this is before we knew about sound waves. All these are examples that people who are reading this should have observed and experienced for themselves. And they would think, well, how could that happen, if there weren't space in there?
Again, in each of those examples, we're looking to observation through the senses for our proof and for our confidence in our conclusion.
Yeah. Right.
And what's the next one, Elaine? Weight.
So the next one, he's getting at density, which is, something that, it was, of course, very important always to physics. But he's already figured out the role of void and density. I just think that's really cool that he did. And he's talking about objects that people would have seen, a ball of wool, a ball of lead. That's nice.
And you could go on to the next example of the fish, but I would emphasize that he throws in the middle of the discussion, but I am forced to step before and answer what some pretend, lest you should be seduced from the truth. He's reminding us that there are reasons why these things are being discussed. We're not just lining up bits of knowledge to put on the shelf. These are issues that are constantly in different forms going to be thrown in our face as we proceed.
Right. So in the 2 paragraphs above, he talked about the liquids moving through the apparent solids. And now he's talking about the solids moving through the liquids and the behavior of the liquids. Just to remind you, there's really no exception. There's no way around this phenomenon of bodies and space. And then in the next paragraph, it sounds to me like he's talking about the creation of a vacuum when the bodies separate, and then the air, which is not void. That's really important to know. The air is a gas. The air itself is not void, so the air has to rush in to fill in the vacuum, and how that happens from the nearest part to the farthest part. He just, nature abhors a vacuum. There you go. I think he's covered all the ways that people would need to be able to connect their observations to what he's asserting.
Now, next week, we'll go a little further into some of his, what the implications of this are. And we didn't read it as part of this week's text, but it is significant. We can probably include it, that the next thing he says is that I could by many arguments confirm this system of a void and fix your faith to what I say. But these small tracts I have drawn to such a searching mind will be enough. The rest you may find out without a guide. For as staunch hounds once put upon the foot will nose soon the mountain game from their thick covers, so you in things like these will one thing by another trace, will hunt for truth in every dark recess and draw her thence. And I quote that only to say that he is really, really emphasizing the importance of what he's covered so far, that bodies exist and so do void. And he's saying that really with that foundation, you can reason everything else that you need to reason. And that's a pretty bold statement, probably because in part because he's contrasting that these things exist, bodies in space, but it's probably also important, equally important or more so, that he's taking the position that besides bodies in space, nothing else exists. That's the extra paragraph that I read when we started.
Right.
I don't know that we're about to wrap up yet, but we're probably getting to the closing section today. But the point that I would probably come back to, unless if somebody has another specific point to raise, please do. In the absence of that, the point I would come back to, I think that a lot of people who are not reading this in as much detail, who are not familiar with Epicurus in as much detail, they're going to go back to this question of how can you be sure that nothing else exists but matter and void? Isn't it possible that in another universe, things exist that are not matter and void? You've not been there, Julie. You haven't been there, Elaine. It's possible, isn't it, that things that are not matter and void exist? And in fact, it's possible that God exists. It's possible that all sorts of things exist because, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, somebody has said. So why should you think that the universe is consistent? Just because it's this tiny speck called Earth, things operate this way.
Yeah. Where
do you get off extrapolating and thinking that everything that exists in the entire universe is the same as it is here on Earth? That's almost ridiculous on its face. There are so many things that exist beyond what's in your philosophy that you just don't know. And so you have to consider that God may have created the universe and that therefore If there's anything in the world that's wrong, it's certainty, because you know you've never been everywhere. You know you haven't existed from an eternity in the past. You know things will happen after you're gone. It is wrong to be certain about taking a position on something as important as that there's no God.
So, and this is where I may personally, I'm still unsure about this, be a slight difference from Epicurus, but I don't know. I think there was a leap in there in the middle of your talking where you went from, is it possible, to then you must consider that it's possible. And I think there's an important leap that's being made there. Do I close off the possibility that there are ways of arranging things that I don't know about? No. I don't, but that I'm not a philosophical skeptic because I don't think that matters. I'm a pragmatist in that I'm going to stick with, what's the most likely thing and treat that as if it's true enough for government work, right? It's true. It's good enough, and I'm going with it, and it doesn't bother me particularly that there are other possibilities out there, but I'm not interested enough in them to think that they're useful topics of discussion, at least not frequently. And so I do not feel obligated to consider them as possibly being as real as what I can observe. That's
another way of asking the question. What's the dividing line between what is possible and what is not possible? Is it ever appropriate to say that something is not possible?
If you're going to be a real good scientist, you would probably not put it that way. That's why we will say ordinary people accuse scientists of hedging on things because we're leaving room for falsifiability. But pragmatically speaking, the only thing that matters to me is, what do we know well enough to proceed on? How am I going to make my life decisions? Am I going to make it based on somebody saying I have to consider their imaginary idea? Or am I going to make my life decisions based on what I can observe and what seems almost certainly to be good enough? And so I don't know if I'm like Epicurus in that. He may have gone a little bit farther to say, no, you must absolutely decide to believe that it has to be that way because you're going to worry otherwise. But I may be an exception. I don't worry about it. This does not bother me whatsoever.
And Epicurus doesn't say you have to decide on this kind of question. He explicitly states that some things should be considered as to be not known at this time.
That's the waiting issue, yes.
Yeah.
And then if Ellie were here especially, she would remind us of the manifold options discussions, that if you can describe not just one, but a series of possibilities that are consistent with the facts and which are not inconsistent with the facts, then to choose between them is itself a function of what soothsayers and mystics do, because you don't have enough information to choose between them. So therefore, if you try to choose between them, you're being arbitrary in your choice. But so there's that. So there are, you're right, Martin has mentioned the issue of waiting and just not taking a position. I think it's also another, probably distinct from that, is the position on manifold options, that if more than one option is out there, then you should not choose between them, which is probably related to waiting, of course. But
yeah, but so and I don't think he would apply the manifold options, choosing between them, to could there be a God, the supernatural God, that is neither matter nor void, because we're not in that situation where we have any evidence for that one. So the pragmatist would say, and so pragmatism as a philosophy didn't exist when Epicurus was there. I like to think he would have agreed with it, but I just hate to put those words in his mouth. The pragmatist would say, well, look, you don't have any evidence for that position. We got plenty of evidence for this, and so let's just go with this. This makes the most sense. But a pragmatist would not say it is impossible that any other answer could be right. They would just say, sort of, who cares?
But the important part is that you have multiple explanations if you do have what's called the manifold options.
Yeah.
As long as they're consistent with your other principles and they don't contradict.
Right, and they don't contradict observed.
It's like
reality.
Lucretius talking about his propositions for meteorology. All of them have been disproven by modern science, but he maintains that the exact causes may not be known in his time.
Yeah.
He did play the waiting game on that.
Yeah.
But like I said, the more important part is that these were explanations he made to fit within the framework of his philosophy, or Epicurean philosophy.
Julie, you haven't weighed in on this, I don't think.
I don't really have a whole lot to add. I agree 100% with everything that Elaine said. And to me, it just comes down to what is useful and what is not useful in our world.
I guess I wanted to touch up on the question we did ask earlier, or not really a question, but when somebody asks us, well, why hasn't this happened? I forget the exact quote that Elaine said, but essentially when people bring up how there may be things you can't conceptualize or you don't know how it happened, like impossibility, we have to ask them, well, within our materialism, it hasn't happened. And even for people who are basically, it's not observable.
Right.
And if it's not observable, why is that? We don't observe. Oh, actually, I just lost my train of thought.
That's easy to do when you get into this. I think that the language can get you a little.
Yeah.
Well, I think unfortunately too, though, you could claim that there are limits to our senses.
Sure.
And so something could happen that, and obviously we're aware of things that happen that we cannot sense. And so I think just not being able to observe something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or it doesn't happen.
That is the answer to the question I raised in the beginning of the issue. What does non-existence mean? Or it's another way of stating that same question. Yes.
That's why I stress epistemology so much, or in our case, the canon.
Yeah. So, Julie, I guess to that I would say we're still, the only thing that we have to go on when we're making our decision is information that is available, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I like the pragmatic, what is useful to us approach.
Yeah.
Because what can you say about anything beyond our knowledge?
Now, I do want to emphasize, unless anybody thinks that means I would not be interested in exploring new ideas. No, if you're a scientist, you're going to be interested in asking questions, but the important thing is to focus on questions that you can address, not on things that have been sort of automatically put beyond your reach. Because when people talk about a supernatural realm, they have by definition said these things are not accessible to us and cannot ever be directly tested, at least during what they say is our life here, or in our afterlife we would, but they're beyond our access. So if something is automatically been placed by another person as an abstract realm that is beyond our senses and beyond our access, no, it's not something I'm going to be interested in trying to test, because you've already told me you can't ever see it. So
it's like the concept of forbidden or esoteric knowledge that I've seen a lot of people talk about recently.
Yeah.
Elaine, what you were just saying is the direction I was going to try to steer us as we concluded the episode for today, because I think that Epicurus' position is very similar to what you've stated your own position is. But to the extent that, and you were questioning whether he would go further than you would, I think that perhaps he would, but I think that he would be phrasing all of this in the context of the discussion we had earlier about the square circle. I don't think that he ultimately would be pointing to his precise physics observations in terms of atoms and void as much as he would be asking us to look at the definitions of the words that we're using. And so that when we start talking about God or supernatural or nature, we really can't make an intelligent assessment of what these questions even mean unless we think about what each word is referring to. And that when you really drill down to whether a word is connected with reality or not, I think it's probably more possible to take very strong positions such as that a square circle cannot exist. And you explain that a square circle cannot exist because squares and circles are only constructs of your mind that are conceptually defined, and you've conceptually defined them in different ways. So they're not going to be unifiable without redefining your words, which is certainly possible if you choose to do that. But it's all ultimately, in that question, a word game. And many of these questions about, is there a God? And how do you know? Because you haven't been there. Many of these things are analyzable, I think, in terms of picking out whether they are actually a word game, which is what you did at the very beginning of the episode when I was asking the questions. You were saying these are things that you have to be very careful with. And I think that's where Epicurus comes from, not only with the observation from the senses, but also with a logical analysis that really will tear apart the opposition and point out that it's one of those emperor has no clothes situations. They're asserting things that are not even wrong, as in the cliche.
And I'd like to say something here in that when I was first learning about Epicurus, this whole kind of general topic is one that I have been interested in for a long, long time and have noticed conflict between what now I understand would be an Epicurean versus a Platonist, but I didn't recognize that was what was happening, and it just irritated the stew out of me when people would go off on these Platonic tangents and get into these word games. But I didn't know that my response to them, how it would be connected to any kind of like philosophic structure. It was one of the things when I read Epicurus, even just reading the principal doctrines, I thought, yeah, he's like me. Pleasure, of course, was a big thing, but it was also things like this where I can't understand a lot of the modern position on these kinds of discussions. And now I understand they're Platonists. It has made some of that much easier for me because I don't have to feel like I'm just some weird outlier who doesn't understand them.
I think touching up on definitions would be good, because a lot of the terminology within Epicurean philosophy is contrasted between contemporaries of Epicurus, but also accepted definitions today. For example, pleasure, the way we conceive of it is very different from the Chironaic sense.
Yeah.
And as Cassius had put out in episode 10, or the thread for it, the Stoics understand God in a very different manner. It's very similar to Baruch Spinoza's God, and that alone is different than like a Platonist sense or a peripatetic or even a Christian understanding. And that's why I think, this is why words have to be, articulated without getting into word games.
Yes.
And that's what part of that certainty comes from within the philosophy. In the Cyril Bailey translation, I believe it's a letter to Herodotus. Yeah, so in the Cyril Bailey translation of Letter to Herodotus, Epicurus, or at least the translation, makes it a point to use the word space, different from void. And we have to understand that our perceptions, or not perceptions, our definitions that are found on a consensus aren't always going to be the same. To some people, they could absolutely define a square circle. And I think we kind of have to be wary of things like that.
Well, they could take those words and change the definition, but then...
But it's for the necessity of consensus to stay put in reality.
Yeah,
and
right.
Words are a key part of that. So we have to understand the relationships between words and understand them at their most basic sense.
Yeah, so I would say any word we know you can deconstruct indefinitely, but we do have to always be able to point to some kind of reality example, at least something that we're extrapolating from, if we really get confused with each other, and just so that we can have a general understanding. We can't completely unhook them and get into an abstract realm, or there's no way that definitions are ever going to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's have a round of closing thoughts here, and we'll go around the table. But so that I don't forget what I want to say at the moment, let me add this, that I think one of the continuing themes and one of the reasons that we're doing the review of the book of Lucretius is to address what a lot of people think is, this is just a physics book, and it's very fascinating about how 2,000 years ago the Greeks came up with atoms and void, even though they didn't have electron microscopes, and gee, isn't that nice, and it's fascinating, and so forth. But I think if Epicurus were here, I think one thing he might say to us is that, in fact, even the basic theory of atoms and void, it is one of those manifold possibilities. And he would have been the first to admit that there might be some differences in the way of expressing it or differences in the way of explaining something once he had additional information to find out about it. But I don't think that would have bothered him. I think that he would have said, I suggested to you one way that was consistent with the facts. If there's another way that's consistent with the facts, then absolutely we should consider that as well. And so he would point to that argument of manifold possibilities, that's what you use to explain what you see around you and put it into a theory that you can then apply and live with. But I think he would also say that more so than the details of his atom and void, he's confronting the logical arguments that these other people are throwing in our face and confusing us with about things like square circles and existences of God and so forth. Epicurus is fighting not only on the ground of physics, but he's fighting on the ground of logic. And when he illustrates for us that you meet logical word games by the senses, that is so absolutely hugely important that everything else kind of fades into the background for me, because every other question comes down to, what is your standard of proof? What is your means of analysis? How are you going to look at something? And Epicurus is answering that over and over by pointing out the method.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my closing thought. But let's go around the table and bring things to a close for today. Who wants to go first? Martin, are you still with us?
Yes, but I don't have a closing statement. I just got a bit hooked on this black universe Elaine mentioned. I just find references to movies and what goes on physics then relates to dark matter. But what does this black universe mean?
I say the black universe, it says only space is real and no motion actually happens. There's no time.
You're saying black universe. I thought you said
block. It is
Block.
block. B-L-O-C-K.
Block universe. B-L-O-C-K.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's called the glow. It's called the growing block theory. I've heard of it.
Why is it a block instead of a circle? I thought the classical analysis of monadism was ever, and in fact Wikipedia has a picture of that on its page for I don't know if it's under Zeno or monadism or whatever, but it's a circle. Why is it a block, Elaine?
I don't know if it actually. I don't know. No idea. But I know that I think all time is synchronous. That there's so I don't know.
It's a five. I think it's a syllogism in like 4 or 5 points. I'd have to look it up again.
Well, I'm sorry, Martin, if you were off on dark as a means of looking for black.
Okay, I can find this out later. I saw now a link about block universe. Okay, that tells something. It looks like nonsense, but anyway, I will have a look.
Yeah, that's kind of my general feeling. This guy this dentist was saying that we're actually all one being at different space positions within the block, and therefore that should make us feel more friendly towards this illusion, these other beings, because they're actually all us. And I'm like, dude, then we're like a monster. So no, I'm not happy about that.
I heard that theory from a cult movie in the 60s.
I don't really have anything to add. I'll just say that, we've talked a lot about abstraction versus, what is practical. And I think that's part of the reason that Epicureanism appeals to me, is because it's much more practical. It's something you can actually apply to your life. So that's its appeal.
And you're confident and you're confirmed in your opinion and you're willing to go with practicality as what's important, even though you've never existed throughout the history of the universe, and even though you haven't been everywhere in the universe, you're going to stick with practicality as your rule.
I am, yes.
Charles?
As I was saying that I don't really have one, just that I kind of want to reaffirm the importance of definitions and consensus and how they differ among different groups and how that leads to misconception and straw man arguments and word games.
I think this has been a very good discussion today.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it.
It was a good discussion.
Especially during the midst of the coronavirus epidemic. or pandemic.
Yeah, right.
But we won't let that stop us, and we'll be back next week, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. All right. I hope everybody has a good week. Lots of pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.